would like to offer you a series of talks that will explain the cultural war that is currently taking place in all nations with a Christian heritage. Between 1917 and 1989, an ideological battle was fought between nations with a Christian heritage. We called this ideological struggle the Cold War. The biblical worldview that built a prosperous Europe had given rise to free market economics. This economic framework had lifted hundreds of millions of our ancestors out of the daily grind of subsistence living. Because of this framework, we, today, can enjoy the many blessings we have access to. Today, we are not living on less than $1 a day, as most of our ancestors did. Then, some 70 years ago, when the period of colonization came to an end, many aspects of this Christian worldview were passed on to other nations around the world. Many democracies were formed in countries that would never have gained democracies in any other way. The biblically based free market framework with legal protections became the expected norm. Since then, most of these countries have also seen rapid development. Billions of people have experienced a massive rise in wealth and overall well-being. Such an outcome has never happened before in the history of humankind. In essence, the Christian worldview has proven, over a long period of time and in a variety of settings, that it offers positive cultural energy. It is not something you throw away lightly. However, 150 years ago, a new theory of social development was created within Western universities. Its supporters believed that economic Marxism, as a theory, would build a more just and fair society. Eventually, after a revolution, this theory of economics was applied in the USSR. It was also applied in East Europe, China, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos. The ideological battle over which theory offered the best hope for our nations almost led to a nuclear war. However, by 1989, it was evident that state-controlled economic Marxism could not generate the energy that was needed to build a flourishing society. It could only offer citizens economic stagnation and oppression. Hence, the USSR collapsed and entered into a form of free market trading. Since then, rapid economic development has occurred. The same has happened in all the nations that once succumbed to the deceptive hopes of Marx's theory. However, since then, in Western nations, new ideas based on Marx's theories have been developed and applied to various social issues. Once again, political activists tell us that these new ideas will create a fairer and more caring society. However, once again, these ideas are very different from the ideas that are inherent in the biblical worldview. Hence, today, an ideological struggle is taking place in all nations with a Christian heritage. Those who push forward with Marx's ideas are seeking to create a new religion or faith. We can call it a faith, for the believers of this new worldview have a belief that if various political ideas are put into the law books, then our nations can look forward to a brighter future. The name of this new faith is progressivism or globalism. Because this new worldview has its roots in Marxism, it is often called cultural Marxism. Those who become disciples of this new faith are often called social justice warriors or woke. We have created this series of lectures to help interested listeners understand this cultural war. These lectures offer a comprehensive analysis of what is happening and why we all should be concerned. We will start off our journey by looking at the roots of this cultural war. For the sake of providing clarity, it's helpful if we take a brief look at the political strategy that the progressives are using to bring about the decline of the West. One might call this political strategy the Marxist game plan. It is a strategy that is consistently used by the progressives as a means to instigate all of their nation-harming pieces of legislation or policies. One can understand this game plan by analyzing what happened when economic Marxism was implemented in the Soviet Union. First, there was the demand that we all should become particularly concerned about the plight of a specific group of challenged citizens, not all groups of challenged citizens, but only the group of citizens that the progressive activists wanted to use as a means to advance their political goals. In Russia, this specific group was the poor. Then, through using their friends in the media and education system, the progressives created a storyline that caused many citizens to have a heightened sensitivity concerning the difficulties that this specific group faced. Next, after having created this heightened sensitivity, The demand was then made that it would be compassionate and fair to implement a political intervention to help this specific group of individuals. In the case of Russia, the heightened sensitivity brought about a revolution. This, they said, would bring about a more just and fair society. However, their suggested legislative interventions always have a toxic element to them. The progressive activists tell politicians that the only way to solve the desperate plight of the specific group they say they care about is if politicians can grant this group the legal right to harm other groups of citizens. We can only help these people by hurting these people. But it will be worth it. Their slogan was, "The ends justify the means." Far more good than harm will be achieved. Hence, in the USSR, tens of millions were murdered in the name of compassion and fairness. And millions ended up living and dying in soul-crushing gulags. Almost all entrepreneurs who had good ideas could never implement them. The average citizen worked in a boring job, typically seeing no improvement in their work environment over the course of their working life. The economy became almost stagnant. Many men turned to alcoholism as a result. And most people lived just above the poverty line. Meanwhile, the Marxist leaders became the new, ruling oligarchs. Most lived comfortable lives, with absolute power to do whatever they wished. Meanwhile, Western democracies powered ahead, allowing ever-increasing numbers of citizens to live economically fruitful lives. In the end, we found out that the Marxist slogan was a lie. Far more harm was done than any good that was achieved. Lastly, those who disagreed with the political intervention that the progressives proposed were given a label which made it seem that they didn't care about the poor. In the USSR, "You're a member of the uncaring bourgeoisie" was something all citizens were frightened of being called. Many citizens did care about the poor, but they could see that the legislative interventions would cause far more harm than good. However, because of this deceptive label, people were scared to speak about the laws that did so much harm. Much needed social discussion was totally shut down because of this misleading label. In other words, despite its admirable goals of seeking to help the poor, the Marxist game plan did not work as a means to build a vibrant society. From what we saw in the USSR, we can see that the essence of the Marxist game plan is as follows. In the name of compassion or fairness for this group of citizens, a political right to harm other, much larger groups of citizens is invented and social decay comes about. Today, in the West, the Marxist game plan has already been used as a means to create laws regarding several social issues. Thus, we have the development of cultural Marxism. For the core progressives to support any social issue, they need one central requirement. The harm done to other groups of citizens, or society as a whole, has to be far more significant than any good that is achieved through the proposed legislative intervention. If the core progressives can't use a social issue to achieve this goal, they won't invest in it. The progressives talk of noble goals. They talk about creating improved social outcomes for particular groups of citizens. Activists talk of high ideals. This draws many thoughtful and intelligent people in to support the proposed legislation. However, the tragedy is that it is always the case that the progressives' political interventions harm more people than they help. Some 30 years later, society ends up with even larger groups of citizens who need our compassion. We will later show why this is always the case. We can look at one of the progressives' present-day social causes to see how they use the Marxist game plan to control the future of a nation. We will look at the issue of transgenderism. If the progressives really wanted to help society, there are much bigger groups than the transgendered that they could be concerned about. For example, there are millions of fatherless boys who are doing extremely poorly. A focused campaign that showed many of their difficulties, with real suggestions as to how they might be helped, would do wonders for our nations. But, assisting such citizens would improve national well-being. This would be counter to the progressives' long-term goals. However, in the gender confused, in this tiny group of citizens, they found a group that they could use to bring about even more social chaos. A few years ago, all the professional psychological associations understood that people who struggled with gender confusion were typically experiencing other underlying psychological issues. For example, many who struggle with gender dysphoria have some form of autism. Thus, they find it hard to relate with people of their own gender. Also, many who experience gender confusion do so because they are experiencing unwanted same-sex attraction. Both these groups of challenged citizens wondered if changing to look like a member of the opposite sex would help them. Through offering a listening ear, many of those who struggled with gender dysphoria were helped to live contented lives in the body of their natal sex. And the research clearly showed that over 85% of teens who struggled with gender confusion grew out of their confusion by the end of puberty. Then, 10 years ago, some politically motivated amateur psychologists in the media, somehow, all at the same time, came up with the storyline that all those who struggled with gender confusion were people who were born in the body of the wrong sex. The collaboration was no coincidence. Through a media onslaught, citizens were asked to become hypersensitive to the plight of the gender confused. The storyline told us, many of those who struggle with gender dysphoria are going to commit suicide if we don't help them now. The political activists told us that legislation would help. People should be allowed to change their gender. And the gender confused should instantly be given access to cross-sex hormones and operations. Counseling would not help them. Offering them counseling was akin to denying their true, natural identity. Thus, in this political process, politicians were asked to change how we all define a man and a woman, from a provable, biologically based definition to an unprovable psychologically based one. In order to shut down any dissent over this new, false storyline, progressive activists then attacked the few psychiatric specialists in this field. They got them fired from gender clinics. Also, they made it increasingly harder for their research to be published in mainstream academic journals. Thus, even though it is a lie, with only one story being told, the born in the body of the wrong sex storyline has increasingly become part of the social fabric. Just 8 years after being dragged into the "we must have compassion for the gender confused" storyline, it's relatively easy to see where the damage will occur. Most notably, such legislation harms women and girls, children, and university departments in many STEM fields. Thus, if the progressives get their way, we might eventually see women's sports being dominated by natal males. Because no one would wish to watch such unfairness taking place, we might witness the end of women's competitive sports. The economic costs will be vast. Moreover, because of the injustice of it all, many women and girls might give up on the sports they love, and obesity will rise, leading to even more social costs. Also, increasing numbers of natal males who claim to be women are now entering social spaces where women are bodily vulnerable. Not surprisingly, rates of rape and sexual abuse are rising. Moreover, tens of thousands of Western children who have a range of pre-existing psychological issues are currently being misleadingly encouraged to claim they are members of the opposite sex. Such children are deceptively being told by online activists that having your sexual organs cut off and becoming sterile is the only way to solve your mental distress. And many are now revealing how they deeply regret their hasty and immature decisions. But their life has already been irrevocably harmed. Also, when politicians create a new way to define male and female, increasing numbers of scientists feel they have to follow the law. For example, natal males who say they are women are now being included in drug trials that are meant for women. The research findings are tainted and thus useless. As a result, millions of physically ill men and women might never get the new drugs they so desperately need. Today, ever-increasing numbers of scientists in many disciplines are complaining that trans theory is harming their work. When scientists are forced through political mandates to use an unprovable definition of male and female, they will find it increasingly harder to prove anything in all scientific fields where the natal sex of the research participants is important. Over time, the science departments of Western universities will corrode from the inside, and Western companies will suffer as a result. And other countries will leap ahead, and our nations will decay. In essence, in a desire to help some 0.01% of the population feel a bit better about themselves, far more extensive harm is caused to the wider society. When passing transgender-supporting laws and policies, social representatives did not think about all the negative consequences. Thus, the Marxist game plan is achieving its desired goals. Moreover, politicians in Western nations are imposing this harm on women, children, and the sciences without asking the population if they wish to be violated in this way. The politicians say, "You, women, you have to undress in front of natal males because we say you have to." Thus, we see the end of democratic traditions. The adverse outcomes of the legal right to change one's sex will eventually be huge. If the media wished, they could make us all hyper-aware of all of the above damage. We would instantly stop this variation of the Marxist game plan. We could then go back to treating gender dysphoria as the psychological disorder it fundamentally is. Next, those who disagree with the politicization of what is a psychological issue are being labeled as transphobic. Of course, most sensible people can see much of the damage that the trans-supporting legislation or policies bring about. They are not transphobic. They are trans-legislation-phobic. They may even have transgendered friends, but they understand that the proposed legislation and policies will create far more social harm than good. Lastly, over the last few years, the progressives have pushed for so-called hate speech legislation. We are told that such laws are needed to protect citizens' feelings. However, such laws are purposely created to stop any discussion around the harm that transgender supporting laws and policies create. We are told we have to be silent as we see women and children being harmed, and our universities being destroyed. In summary, in transgender activism, we see the Marxist game plan in action. Such activism affects all of us. Once a handful of politicians get involved in the authoritarian redefining of male and female, once they push falsehoods into the social fabric, we all have to figure out how we will deal with these lies. In our own field of responsibility, all of us have to decide whether we wish to let our nations be controlled by ideologues who wish our countries harm. Ideally, politicians will humble themselves and admit they have no mandate or moral authority to pass a law that allows a natal female to be legally registered as a natal male. Ideally, our nations relearn that gender confusion has its roots in other, pre-existing psychological issues. And we especially make this clear in our schools. Lastly, ideally, we train more psychotherapists to use the protocols that once helped thousands of gender-confused teens to become happy in their natal sex. In this section, the primary intention was to show how the Marxist game plan is used to bring about the end of our democracies. We will later come back to look at the issue of gender confusion in more depth.